I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'd like to thank President Dennison and the President's Office for hosting this. Our speaker today is here as part of the President's Lecture Series, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Marlene Zook, who is a leader in my personal field, a leader in evolutionary biology and in behavioral ecology. She has done foundational work on the processes of sexual selection and animal behavior on a variety of organisms from fowl birds to, not that birds are foul, from fowls to insects, most especially on crickets. And she has done something that few people in our field take the time to do, which is to put a lot of effort into communicating the excitement and the importance of a lot of the work that we do to a much broader audience than we often take the time to do in academia. So Professor Zook is here from the Department of Biology at the University of California at Riverside. She is a former, I believe, president of the International Society for Behavioral Ecology. She's an elected member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. As I said, truly a leader in our field. So it is an honor and a pleasure to introduce her today. I want to also point out that she has a book called Sexual Selections: What We Can and Can't Learn About Sex from Animals, and it is actually on sale at the back of the auditorium, and she has offered to stick around afterwards and sign them to people that are interested. So apologies for the shameless plug. Here she is. Thank you.
Hey, don't apologize to me. Thank you, and again, thanks to the President's Office and to the people here who've made our visit really a wonderful one, also to, in particular, Richard Drake and Michelle Shaughnessy. I really appreciate it. So, let's talk about sex. Those of us who study animal behavior, as I do, get used to the idea that people want to talk to us about what we do. They want to hear about our research, but they really want to come and tell us stories about their pets, or they want to ask us about something that they saw on the Discovery Channel. And more than that, they want to try and understand whether a lot of the things that they see in animals and what animals do can tell us something about our own behavior. Nowhere is this more obvious than in matters having to do with sex and gender, and I discover this all the time when my phone rings and it's someone who asks, as they did actually fairly recently, they had a question about oral sex in animals. That's actually, it turned out, who would know, that it was one of the most common things that people ask me about when they hear I've written this book. The first time I was really flummoxed. The second time I was like, oh, okay. By the third time it was, oh, right, yeah, you want to know what, oral sex in animals. And so I've gotten used to this. I've also become, for better or worse, and Doug can attest to this, the kind of go-to person for information about gay penguins. And so if anyone wants to know about that, I'm not going to talk about it in a lot of detail here, but we can, I will be happy to share. And so people are interested in this kind of thing for a variety of reasons. And I got interested in what we can and can't learn about sex from animals, in part because as I did my research on sex and the evolution of differences between males and females, which is what I do, I started thinking that this was a very interesting area of study, especially in light of the fact that I've also been interested for many years in women's rights and in social issues having to do with men and women and equality of the sexes and so forth. And so initially I thought that these two areas of being interested in the evolution of differences between males and females in all kinds of animals and being interested in males and females and sex roles and sexual equality in humans would complement each other very nicely, and that I would be able to, and that each of them would have something to say to the other. As I continued in science and continued to have colleagues who were interested in feminism, though, I started realizing that although people are very interested in animal behavior, like I said, and they want to understand some stuff about humans, when you start talking about sex and gender, they kind of get a little touchy. And I had originally assumed that And so this is, I should, and so they start asking questions. This is another one that, so the oral sex one, people ask me a lot. The other really common question that I get is it foreordained for, men to want to cheat on their partners, and, therefore is adultery natural? And the other thing, I've become quite enamored of Google Image, and let me tell you, this is something that comes up. If you just type adultery into Google Image, anyway, so this was one of the arenas that people would ask me questions about. But what started happening was that I realized there was this real, instead of being what I thought a very harmonious combination of kind of the social justice and equality side and the evolutionary biology side, that instead there was kind of this tension where, on the one hand, my scientist colleagues were surprised by the idea that maybe biases about women or biases about the sexes could influence the way they were doing science, and that maybe people who'd thought about social equality could have something to say to scientists. They thought they sort of discounted that because, as far as they were concerned, science was completely objective. And on the other hand, my feminist colleagues and friends were very suspicious of the idea that biases about the sexes can be informed at all by a scientific viewpoint. And their idea or their worry is that people have so often used biology as an excuse for behavior like male violence or adultery or whatever, by saying that the sex roles that we see are in our genes, that it's just too dangerous to start talking about a potential biological underpinning for human behavior. So the book that I wrote, Sexual Selections, tries to steer a path between these two extremes by looking at animals from both the feminist perspective, talking to scientists, and from a scientific perspective, reflecting on what this can tell us about gender. And so what I'm going to do this evening is read you some bits and pieces from the book and just talk about some of the issues that it raises. And I'm going to start by reading from a chapter that's called Sex and the Death of a Loon. He stood outside the door of the museum, barefoot, very tanned, and wearing only a faded pair of denim cutoffs. He was clutching a large bird to his chest. The bird was barely alive, eyes shut, its black and white feathers moving slightly. "Can you help him?" asked the young man, staring hopefully at me. After finishing my undergraduate degree, I worked in the small vertebrate museum on the campus of the University of California at Santa Barbara, and such requests were not uncommon. Birds frequently washed up on the beaches covered in oil or otherwise hurt, and sometimes we could let them heal in a cage in the museum until they were ready to fly away. Not this time, however. I pointed out that the bird, which I identified as a common loon, was nearly dead, and that while there was nothing to be done for it, I'd be happy to take it for the museum's skin collection. Stuffed birds were used both as research specimens and for teaching. In my own vertebrate zoology course, I'd learned how to identify many of the local species by examination of taxidermy mounts like that. And now, having graduated, I was learning how to prepare the specimens myself, and fresh material was always welcome. He was horrified. How could I be so ghoulish when the poor creature was still alive? While we were arguing about it, the loon died in his arms. I eyed it cheerfully. After a little more persuasion, he agreed to donate the bird to our collection, and I started the paperwork. Skins are always more valuable if information about their collection is kept with the specimen, and so I noted the date, the place on the beach where the bird had been found, and asked the man his name. "Wing Bamboo," he said. I paused. It was Southern California, it was the 1970s, but while people named Rainbow and Running Water were commonplace in the food co-op, you usually didn't see them in the museum donating dead birds. Should I write bamboo, comma, wing? W, period, bamboo. Was it all one word? In the end, I wrote it down just as he'd said it and told him to put the bird on the table. He gazed at it and put it down, but only after clutching it a little tighter and intoning, "Goodbye, Brother Loon." At the time, I just rolled my eyes and put the bird in a plastic bag with a label, figuring he'd seen too many reruns of the then popular film Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. But since then, I've thought about the encounter several times, and two elements of it remain intriguing. First, why did he need to claim this kinship with a bird that he couldn't identify, knew nothing about, and had never interacted with? And second, why did he call it brother and not sister? Now, people have always looked to animals as illustrations and models of behavior. From Aesop to the Bible to modern literature, animals are held up as representing virtues and vices. We have industrious bees and ants, and wily foxes, and untrustworthy snakes. It's only a short leap from those fables to the conviction that certain types of behavior in humans and non-humans are natural and meant to be the way they are. And I think that perhaps because we hold our ideas about sex and gender very dear, nowhere is this claiming of biologically intuitive high ground more obvious than in matters of sex and sex roles. And so you watch a mother animal with her babies on her back, and you watch her devoting herself to the care of those offspring, and you think, well, females must instinctively know how to be mothers, and so therefore maternal behavior is natural, voluntary childlessness is not. Or in a lot of animals, overt aggression is more likely to be observed in males, and I'll get back to this a little bit later on. And so although the concept of the pecking order was first originated in the early 1900s by a biologist who was watching groups of female chickens, we tend to associate the pecking order and its relative, the dominance hierarchy, with males, so that the term alpha male has really made it into our everyday vocabulary. And it's as though we use animals as role models in this odd parody of art imitating life, imitating art. We see our stereotypes played out in animals and then approve or disapprove of human behavior based on whether it fits the roles that we assign to those animals in the first place. And there's no place where this is clearer than with respect to the kinds of animals we use as models and as model systems. And we use, and what I'm going to argue is that we tend to use lots of animals as archetypes, like I was saying, you've got the wily foxes or the industrious ants or so forth. But I think in a greater sense, what we tend to do is use males as a model system, not just in some animals, but in life as a whole. And that skews our perspective on both sexes. And that's why our friend Wing Bamboo called the loon brother. Now, although attitudes are, I think, changing, the paradigm in science for a long time has been to view the male of a species, including humans, as the norm, and females or women as variations or special cases or exceptions to the rule. I first noticed this in a very personal way when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, which has a large medical school. And posted on the walls would be advertisements calling for volunteers, people that would want to participate in medical studies where you would, ride an exercise bicycle for a certain number of minutes, and then they would take blood samples to look at blood gas levels at different time periods, or you would be injected with some substance and an allergic reaction would be measured and so forth. And so they wanted you to participate as a subject in a medical research study. They paid what at that time seemed to me like a nice amount of money, and I was a graduate student and so was poor, and I was very eager to participate. But I was taken aback to discover that virtually all of the ads called for males between the ages of 18 and 25. They never wanted women to participate. And so I started getting intrigued by this idea, in part because I was taking a Women in Science seminar course at the time. And I started wondering about the extent to which people used males as sort of the model for the way they thought things worked, including the human body. So what I did for the seminar as my project is to go through some physiology journals that actually didn't deal with humans but used other animals even as, because I didn't want to get into this potential social restrictions on using men versus women and so forth. So let's just talk about using your rats or mice or monkeys or so forth. And I was just curious to see whether or not they used both sexes, which you would expect if they were doing this at random, or whether they preferentially chose males. And I did this if anyone's interested in all the details, I can give them to you later, but the bottom line is that overwhelmingly what happened was that if there was, and I chose subjects that had nothing to do with reproduction, so, pulmonary function or something with, blood constituents or what have you. And so that wasn't an issue. And so what I found was that the scientists overwhelmingly chose males as their subjects. And I also actually called some of the suppliers to see whether male rats were cheaper or easier to obtain. It turned out they weren't. And this bias actually occurs, and if you look for it, you'll see it in medical texts, in a lot of research, although that's changing to some extent, and in a lot of tests, for instance, of drug effectiveness. And the rather disturbing result is that virtually all of the discussion and diagrams of the normal functioning of, the liver, the kidney, the respiratory system, and most other non-reproductive parts of the body use the proverbial 70-kilogram man as their subject. Well, what I was often told was that somehow the reproductive cycles, yes, but there's a good reason for this. The reproductive cycles of females, at least in mammals, would obscure the real findings, as if the kidney were somehow a sexless structure able to be examined in isolation. The cyclical nature of female reproduction in mammals was seen as unwanted noise that obscured a view of the real system. This seemed peculiar to me for two reasons. For one, the reproductive cycle, I don't think, adds any more noise to, the workings of the rest of the body than the workings of the eye would add to a study of other sense organs. I mean, no one's going to suggest that hearing is best studied in the blind, even if there's interaction between vision and the auditory system. I mean, this isn't to suggest it might not be interesting to do that, to study hearing in the blind, but as sort of the archetype, the way the model system, it seems like an odd way to progress if indeed most people have both operating at the same time. The point is that female variation is no less valid and no more unusual than any other sort of variation. The second problem is that even if women's reproductive cycles do influence, say, drug effects, this seems like very valuable information to have if we're hoping to treat women, reproductive cycles and all, with the drug whose effects we're testing in these men. And I should also point out, of course, that current research practices are not so biased. There's been a very concerted effort by the National Institutes of Health over the last several years to try and overcome this bias. But I think this basic notion that males are kind of where you start, they're the model system, is still with us. And I think one of the best illustrations of this comes from some work on mental health in humans that was conducted by I.K. Broverman and colleagues quite a long time ago, in which the participants were mental health clinicians, so people who were counselors or psychologists or whatever, and they were given questionnaires with dichotomous topics like competitive, not competitive, emotional, not emotional, and they were asked to use those descriptors to describe either a healthy, mature, socially competent adult, where the sex was unspecified, a healthy, mature, socially competent man, or a healthy, mature, socially competent woman. And so they were supposed to describe that with this combination of characteristics. So the question is, all right, they're asked to describe an adult. Well, are females still sort of falling within human characteristics? Apparently not. Males and, now interestingly, so males and females were described differently. That's not surprising. I mean, we know that males and females differ in our society in lots of ways, and that's common. But what was more disturbing is that the description the subjects gave of a man was virtually identical to the description they gave for a healthy, mature, socially competent adult. Women, however, were not the same thing as adults. They were different. And so it's as though women can't be both feminine or female and human, because the model system is male and females can't be its representative. Now, to our relief, certainly as social observers, and if there are any sociologists in the crowd, I do know that the actual paper that this is based on has come under attack by sociologists for some of the ways in which they constructed the questionnaires and so forth. But the main point and the relevance to other aspects of science, including my field of animal behavior, is clear. Scientists, like other people, tend to view what males do as the norm, and what females do is sort of a subcategory. And a good recent example of this that is closer to my own field comes from a series of monographs called The Birds of North America, which is, as you might imagine from the title, an exhaustive survey of each and every species of bird on the continent. And so there are these accounts of each species that are written by an expert or team of experts in that, on that species. And each one has a color photograph of the bird on the front cover. Now, virtually all the photos feature a male as the species representative, but when feminist scientist Patty Gawani, who's a friend of mine, was invited to write about her species, which was the eastern bluebird, she rebelled. And she wrote the editor of the series, Alan Poole, and asked for special dispensation. And she was emailing me about this, and she said she wanted the editor, so this is quoting from her email, to please, just this time put a photograph of a male and a female. After all, I do study monogamy. It would be appropriate. Besides, the females are pretty. I begged. Stony silence. I brought it up at least 8 times. Alan was really a stone. When the box of reprints came, I peeked in, and with great disappointment exclaimed, "There's only one bird in the photograph." Then I looked at it. The front actually has a single, gorgeous, female bluebird. There is no legend. I actually do consider this my most significant accomplishment in the feminist construction of science. So I think that this, so people who think, oh yes, but this is just something that a few people do, it's not very pervasive. It is pervasive. This idea of looking at males as though they represent everything. Where I see it a lot is in my students, where in classes that I teach when we go in the field, or even when students talk about animals that they're seeing or reading about, they call them all he. All of them. Birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, insects, they're all he. And it's difficult to train yourself out of this generalization, even when it should be obvious that, these are students, they're watching animals do things in the field. You end up saying, you can put yourself in a position of not seeing what's there, because you say, oh, look at the bird, he's flying, along to the tree, he's landing on a branch, he's going into the nest, he's laying an egg. And it makes you less likely to see things that are going to be characteristic of females. And certainly, in the case of social insects like ants and bees, you can actually miss the pertinent biology and make some mistakes, because, as you probably know, in most species, only females forage for the colony. They're the ones you see. So, you got the ants going in your sugar bowl, you have the bees flitting from flower to flower. All of the social insects that you are likely to see in your life, unless you keep bees or do something very separate, they're all females. They're all females. And I have an extraordinarily hard time convincing my students of this. They're very skeptical. So some of it, I think, we can lay really at the feet of popular films that have perpetuated this. So okay, there was also A Bug's Life, which also had, if some of you, this is a real sore point with me, so I really remember it. But it had the main character that was also a male, social insect. And here, it's not his day, it's her day, okay? Every ant has her day. Why are they doing this? And so it just sort of feeds onto this myth. I was in, I know I am really touchy about this, but I find it just extraordinary that people do this constantly. I was in Australia on sabbatical last year, and there are these and in Central Australia there are these wonderful ants called honey ants that the photograph shows on the left here in the slide. And honey ants are called honey ants because certain individuals, females, stay in the colony underground, and their abdomens grow swollen with honeydew that they sequester for the rest of the members of the colony, so the other ants come up and tap them with their antennae, and they'll regurgitate a drop of this honeydew as food. So they in fact are serving as like living storage organs for the rest of the colony. And it turned out that in Central Australia there was a children's show called Yamba the Honey Ant on the sort of equivalent of PBS. And I thought, oh cool, this is really, I mean, I like insects, and I thought this would be really kind of a neat thing. I have a Yamba the Honey Ant, like refrigerator magnet. I thought it was going to be really fun. But I thought, but I've got to find out. I have to find out. And so, we stayed for one night in a hotel, and I'm frantically like going through the TV channels trying to find Yamba the Honey Ant on TV, and I did, and it's a boy. This was so awful. I don't understand why they do this to children. It's just warping them. I know stereotypes are hard to break, but I think that's sort of where we've got, Wing Bamboo, politically correct, though he probably fancied himself, viewing the loon as his brother and not some female relative. Now, I know that a lot of people will argue that this is just terminology and that's not the major issue, and really I know I am a little weird about the social insects and the he and she thing, but the importance of language in structuring our thinking and the use of man as a false generic is kind of beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about here, but it is really clear that how we speak, often unconsciously, constrains the way we think. Children asked to draw a firefighter will draw one of either sex. If you ask them to draw a fireman, they'll draw a man. And incidentally, if they're asked to draw a scientist, this is what children draw. He is most often white. He is almost always a man, so I'm using he advisedly here. And more likely, interestingly, he has facial hair and glasses. So I don't know what those last two things mean, but that's people's image of a scientist. And so, the idea is that if people are describing either categories of other people or animals only in one sex, they're only going to think of them that way. And they're going to miss what females do, both in our own culture and in those of animals. So model systems are, there's nothing wrong with them. We all use them for a lot of reasons. But what the problem is, and this is just, the idea that we're using lots of different model systems, and actually the thing about the kangaroo gene, I bet a lot of you didn't know there was a kangaroo genome project. Again, this is from my stint in Australia. I was kind of captivated by this. But what I want to do now is sort of look at the ways that this can actually influence the way we think about animals and about sex and gender by introducing a concept that I found very useful in recent years. And that's an idea called gender schema, which are hypotheses, conceptions that we have about the sexes that let us generalize about things that we found to be true. And I first became aware of this concept in a book by Virginia Valian called Why So Slow? And the title question refers to why women have been relatively slow to advance in a lot of professions and suggests that we're hampered without necessarily knowing it by our pre-existing biases in considerations of what males and females, men and women, are like. And this can apply to lots of characteristics like value, from value-laden ones like which sex is better at math or science, to more innocuous ones like physical traits. And one example from her book is that there was a study in which university students were asked to estimate the height of people, both men and women, that were shown sitting or standing next to a reference object. This is not one of the photos that was used. It just gives you an idea of how they did this. And unbeknownst to the subjects, the men and women in the photographs were matched for height. So there were just as many tall men as tall women and short, men and short women. But when the people did the estimations, as I'm sure you can imagine from what I've been saying, people consistently overestimated the height of the men and underestimated the height of the women. Now, in a sense, there's nothing wrong with this. They're using a schema, they're using the schema that they have in their heads that say men are taller than women. Well, men are taller than women on average, that's fine. But that judgment then clouds your ability to perceive each individual case. I'll be happy to discuss this idea in more detail as it applies to participation of women in science if people are interested later on. Right now, I want to take it back to our ideas about animal behavior. Marcy Lawton and her colleagues at the University of Alabama at Huntsville re-examined a very meticulous study that was done of pinyon jays, which are relatives of crows and other types of jays that are native to the southwestern United States. The birds live in these groups of anywhere from 50 to 500, and they're highly social, so you see them together a lot. The researchers who wrote the book sought, as many of us would if we were doing a study like this, to see if there was sought a dominance hierarchy among the males that would structure the group. And they remarked, as they were doing this, upon the relatively low level of aggression among the males. And they spent a lot of time documenting very subtle signs between the males. So, there'd be these kind of downward glances from one of the males, and then the other male would kind of go like this. And that would be interpreted as a major, like sign of who was on top and so forth. But if you read the book, it's clear that there actually was a lot of aggressive behavior going on. It just happened among the females, not the males. In fact, female pinion jays engage in what was called the most aggressive behavior observed during the year, with vigorous physical battles, like actual knockdown, drag-out fights, that exceeded anything that was observed in the males. But female dominance is never explored in the book, and they only state that, quote, in late winter and early spring, birds become aggressive toward other flock members. Mated females seem especially testy. Their hormones surge as the breeding season approaches, giving them the avian equivalent of PMS, which we call PBS, pre-breeding syndrome. Now, first, I should emphasize that this study actually it's a wonderful study by people who did a terrific job on this species. But the scientists were doing what all of us do at one time or another, which is to use our models for what males and females are like as a lens through which to view animals. If you don't think females are aggressive, then you interpret what you see in light of your stereotype, which is a female with, well, PMS, although it's hard to imagine female pinion jays getting like bloated and puffy and crying easily or something, so I'm not quite sure how they would. But anyway, so this whole idea that you kind of see what you want to see pervades a lot of what we do with respect to animals. And I want to just read a little bit from another chapter in the book, which is talking about female aggression and dominance, called The Alpha Chicken. It would seem that we've come full circle when a feminist author gives advice to a male presidential candidate on how to act more like a chicken. In the fall of 1999, the media was a-twitter with the news that Naomi Wolf, author of The Beauty Myth, had advised Democratic hopeful Al Gore on how to dress and act. But it wasn't just fashion advice or image shaping. Apparently, Wolf was counseling Gore on how to be an alpha male. His position as second in command, the columnists fretted, had left Gore with an air of second best. And the solution was some coaching that would make him take on more of the aura of a winner. Now, Wolf herself denies having dwelled on this whole alpha versus beta in her consultations, but, as is often the case, the reality of the situation was eclipsed by reaction to it. Now, a lot of aspects of this were interesting, at least in passing. What I found interesting at the time was that everybody knew what an alpha male was, or thought they did, and everyone seemed to agree that Gore would want to be one. According to the New York Times, alpha males dominate and lead other members of the pack, while beta males are subordinate and play a helpmate role. Life is better when you're on top, the reasoning went, and for evidence, one simply had to look at animals, which of course everyone assumed that's where all this came from, where dominance and aggression were the rule of the day and males spent their time jockeying for position in the herd or flock or school. And dominance hierarchies seem to really make intuitive sense to people. And then, taken further, this whole idea about male dominance and alpha males can be seen as responsible. You think, well, male violence against women and warfare are just inevitable because they're all part of this natural thing that males are going to be on top. And another New York Times writer seemed to suggest that being an alpha male in politics, as in wolf packs, is tied to having lots of sex. Why else would you want to be one? And the implication in the article was that Americans will forever be frustrated because we want our politicians to be dominant and aggressive without being licentious, and such a combination is as unlikely to occur among senators as among elephant seals. But The problem is that, as I alluded to earlier, the scientific study of dominance really started by looking at females. And a Norwegian biologist named Thorleif Schjelderup Eby documented dominance hierarchies in chickens in the barnyard, female chickens, hens. And he looked at pecking among these hens, and one hen would peck another who would retreat. And they'd remember the relationships between who pecked and who retreated for quite some time, and these became established in the flock and determined who got the best sleeping sites or the most access to food or something like that. And he worked for a long time on this and pointed out that social relationships were very complex. He said that they were not always predictable, and what was doubtless one of the earliest comments on the genetic basis of behavior, he mused that the tendency to social structure is in the chicken's blood. It is inherited rather than learned, which is an interesting observation. But of course, these were entirely groups of females. And so the original expression is, really alpha hen, not alpha male, though this is probably not worth pointing out either to Al Gore or the New York Times. Now, as scientists, of course, we know that females are aggressive, and we know that they're aggressive in lots of circumstances. For example, you see females doing things like destroying eggs in other females' nests in some species of birds, or doing things like, in their associations with other females in a social group, suppressing the reproduction of those females, which from an evolutionary perspective is a fate worse than death. But so at least the idea that females can never be aggressive or dominant has, oh sorry, I meant to show you, so these are the real alpha chickens, and this is really what Gore should have been aspiring to. So the idea that females can actually be aggressive and dominant is not necessarily so prevalent among scientists anymore. But there are still a lot of myths that pervade our ideas about the way males and females interact that are related to aggression. One of them is that somehow male aggression in sex is tied to hunting prey. And here, people have suggested that locating a living animal and stalking it and killing it are, sort of macho acts. And because in the prototypical human hunter-gatherer society, men are supposed to have done a lot of the group hunting, the reasoning goes that natural selection for good hunters gave us kind of willy-nilly, without us meaning to, hostile men. And some people have taken a slightly different tack and suggested that therefore the acts of courtship and sex itself, whether it's in humans or other animals, stems from behaviors that are essential to hunting, in which, can you guess, the man is a predator and the woman is his prey. One of the earliest of these proponents was Havelock Ellis, who was a psychologist who wrote a landmark book about sex in the early 20th century. And he thought that in animals, the act of copulation represented the hunter grasping his prey, which was why males were on top of females in animals, as he said. In humans, however, quote, the male may be said to retain the same attitude, but the female has turned round. She has faced her partner and approached him, and so symbolizes her deliberate consent to the act of union. So he felt like there was this tension about aggression and hunting, but that somehow humans were sort of managing to overcome it. And so, regardless of whether it was in humans or animals, Ellis thought that a certain female reluctance was to be expected, and so the male was expected to pursue and the female was expected to hang back. And similar parallels between courtship and predation were drawn by several of the early animal behaviorists, who also noted that there's similarities between the displays that are given in courtship and the way males will behave during their hunting or their prey gathering. Now, I read this and think that, really Ellis needs to get out more because, I hope I'm not going to, be too graphic here, but when animals have sex, it doesn't always look like the way we envision humans having sex, or even the way some of our barnyard animals or pets that are most familiar to us have sex. I've always always wondered what Havelock Ellis would have done and whether his book would have been different if he knew about sex in crickets. In field crickets, females, which are the larger sex, are the ones that mount the males. So this is a female, and that's her ovipositor here. And the male has to extrude this little sperm package or spermatophore. You can probably only see this if you're in front, but it's like a container of sperm that's threaded into the reproductive opening of the female. And this is all very fussy and painstaking, and absolutely is not done through any aggressive behavior on the part of the male. And, really, although, for instance, frontal copulation that Ellis was so impressed with is not the rule, it occurs in a variety of animals, and, it may appeal to us that some animals do engage in it. It's not particularly significant. And I think it's not really there's just no support in the animal kingdom for this idea that courtship is modeled after predation. So, and in part this is because hunting in animals is a more widespread and kind of less glamorous profession than it's sometimes made out to be. I mean, we tend to think, hunting is macho, and so we identify with things like, animals like lions or falcons that will hunt warm-blooded prey and, bring it down as it screams for its life or something like that. But there's no a priori reason to dismiss insectivores like warblers or hedgehogs from the ranks of predators. I mean, why is it any less savage to bite a worm than a weasel? Why is a hawk swooping down on a mouse seen as more aggressive than a songbird snapping its bill against the hard shell of a beetle? Hunting is getting food, it's not waging war. And I think that this idea that we're deriving courtship from predation, and even if predation were aggressive, which are both ideas I just cast doubt on, the fact remains that actually virtually all animals, males and females, both hunt. And in lions, of course, females do most of the hunting. Male violence is present, but it's directed toward rival males and their offspring, and infanticide is common. The role of male hunting in human evolution is the subject of hot debate among anthropologists, but in animals that don't hunt cooperatively, males don't just go out and bring home the bacon or the seal meat or the caterpillars or whatever. Any tendencies toward aggressive behavior that came from hunting food would have to occur in both sexes. And it seems to me that, aggression is a lot more than striving to be alpha. I'm not denying that it exists. It's just that it's a little bit more subtle than the way it was laid out to Al Gore in the presidential campaign, which, may explain some things. I guess I'm not really going to go there, as they say. So what I want to do now is to consider briefly, my point here has been that biases about gender are getting in the way of our ability to really see what animals are doing or to interpret what animals are doing in the way we look at our own behavior. And what I'd like to finish with is some more recent information about animal behavior and how it's being viewed by scientists. Now, red-winged blackbirds, as you probably know, are a sort of harbinger of spring throughout North America, and they can become so numerous that they're a pest in grain fields. Back in 1971, a wildlife biologist named Olin Bray attempted to control populations of redwings by vasectomizing the males, figuring that, the problem is, of course, the birds are pretty, you can't just start, there would be public hue and outcry if you just went out there and slaughtered a whole bunch of red-winged blackbirds wholesale. So they were trying to figure out ways to do this in a more kind of socially acceptable way. And so he said, if we can vasectomize the males, then they just won't produce any fertile eggs and the populations will go down. Problem was, this didn't work. The females kept laying fertile eggs. They checked, they'd really vasectomize the males. And the authors of this study were stumped. They could not figure out what could possibly have been going on if, in fact, this was occurring. And they finally, and if you read the paper, it's really interesting, they very kind of peevishly conclude in the end that there was females that were promiscuous. And there's this implication that they were misbehaving, that if the females had just behaved correctly, that everything would have been okay. this behavior, or this paper kind of died away in the literature. And in my opinion, Olenbray missed out on what turned out to be one of the great revolutions in behavioral ecology of the last several decades, which is that even in many apparently monogamous bird species, there is a lot of what we now call extra-pair copulations, i.e. matings outside of the pair between a male and a female, going on. And the details of this are fascinating, but I don't have time to go into them. But what happened was that there was this focus on, initially on, well, this was just kind of, somebody was doing something wrong here. This was not the way things really were. Even when we did, through the use of DNA fingerprinting technology, become able to understand the prevalence and the extent of these extra-pair copulations, which are fetchingly called EPCs in birds, even when we started understanding that, the papers that were initially coming out were oddly divided, so that either they would call either the males were roaming around taking advantage of these hapless females who were waiting innocently in their own territories for the breadwinner males to come home and defend them, or else the females were these brazen hussies who were seducing blameless males who otherwise would not have strayed from the path of moral righteousness into turpitude. And you really do see this in papers. We can return, in fact, to our earlier image, and you start asking a somewhat different question. So that one paper published in Nature, which is one of the most prestigious scientific journals around, calls young warblers that were fathered by males not paired with the mother as being illegitimate, as if their parents had little tiny avian marriage licenses and they had chirped their vows. Birds can't get married. They don't have, which is something I often end up having to say when people ask me the stuff about the gay penguins, that you feel like you should not have to have a PhD to tell people that penguins, whether they're straight or gay, can't get married. Marriage is a human institution. I don't know why people try to do this. I guess in some ways this should not come as a surprise. Everybody knows that, it was Hester that had to wear that scarlet letter, not her partner. And the double standard of judging adultery in humans has received a lot of attention from sociologists and feminist scholars and so forth. And, I recognize that we often use terms from human behavior to describe animals. Sometimes it's impossible to avoid. But I really think that there's some caution in order here, not just because we don't want to be anthropomorphic, but because our own biases about gender can keep us from actually seeing what the animals are doing. All right, let me conclude with a slightly different caution. So I'm not the only person that's noticed that there's been a male bias in looking at animal behavior, and in fact, there's been a lot of increased awareness about the pitfalls of male bias. And this has sometimes led to a championing of more politically correct subjects, as it were. And so we therefore point with triumph to discoveries of sexually aggressive females or very nurturing males. And you can kind of get in this argument with everybody having their poster children for their favorite concepts. So, the traditionalists point out that in many species like elephant seals, males are still dominant and, are pushing females around, often killing their offspring. To be countered with the more kind of New Age image of a pregnant male seahorse. In seahorses, as you may know, females give the eggs to the males carry them around in a pouch and in effect give birth later on, so they're the ones who do all the work, of paternity or of parenting there. The other species that's gotten a lot of attention are bonobos, which are small relatives of chimpanzees that have very sort of fluid sexual lives. They're highly social, and sex occurs both between members of the same sex, very frequently between females, between juveniles, between adults and juveniles, and so forth. And people are always captivated by this. And everybody who was around in the 60s, and a lot of people who weren't, keep saying that they're the original species who were in make love, not war, and that we should, there's things saying that we should really be modeling ourselves after bonobo society, and people are really sort of holding them up as role models. And I suppose you could triumphantly, or not, conclude with the sexual cannibalism. and where, you know, females just eat the males after mating, and figure that that should put an end to the argument. But, you know, it's good to have new models, and it's really good to understand diversity in animals. This is something that I'm a big fan of. But I think it's important that we realize two things. The first one is that we really ought to be capable of coming up with our vision of an ideal society without needing to have an example in snow geese or gorillas. Even the best model system is not the same thing as a role model. And second, we need to make sure we don't lose sight of what the animals themselves are actually doing. Certainly I, as an animal behaviorist, got into this business because of an interest in animals and not in ideology. So to me, it's their behavior that's important here, sometimes even more so than our own. Thanks a lot. And I'm happy to take questions, except I'm not hugely able to see, so I don't know if you want to turn the lights up in the audience a little bit. So I have no idea whether anyone has any questions or not.
I think you illustrated very well to the point the fact that since the 19th century, the scientific discourse about nature has been tainted by ideology, has been used for political purpose, to justify slavery, to justify women's subservience and oppression, etc. And you made that point very clear. And also that what epitomizes that situation, that is to say the reproduction of the metaphor of difference passes through a certain way of treating the metaphor of reproduction. That's very clear. But I'm more concerned, and we still live under the threat of sociobiology, especially now, which is works at the higher levels. It's scientists, male and female, by the way, animals who are gendered in our language are often referred as sheep, that's sociobiology, where the scientists try to pinpoint a certain behavior kind to a gene. I think that's much more dangerous. But still, going back to your title, you say that what can we learn as humans from the sexual behavior of animals? And what, from my understanding, we cannot learn anything. Am I correct?
No, actually, and certainly as someone who makes their living off of studying sex in animals, I would hate to think that there's nothing we can learn about sex from animals. But part of what it involves, I think, is which questions are interesting ones to ask. To me, asking, is adultery natural, is not a very productive question. But asking, gee, look at all of this diversity in which animals do and don't engage in these extra pair copulations. Why is it that you see these in some kinds of birds living in some kinds of circumstances and not in other kinds of birds living in other circumstances? What are the selective pressures that are going to lead to greater degrees of extra pair copulations versus lower degrees of extra pair copulations? Why are snow geese monogamous and lots of other, and warblers are not? That to me is an interesting question, and we can learn in short about how there are more different solutions to the same problem than we ever thought possible. Because I think that people often look at animals and they say, oh, well, see, all animals are showing us is that the only way to exist is to have dominant males and subservient females. But that's not it at all. So in part, what I think you can learn is which questions give you interesting information about the animals, and then how that in turn can show us that there are a lot of different solutions to similar sorts of problems that we all face as animals.
Thank you for your answer quickly. Then for you, human sexuality is the same as animal sexuality. So that means you refuse to consider what psychoanalysis, critical literary, social critical theory has discovered as imagery, as gender, as sexual, as biology, and that is language changing totally things totally. That means you cannot compare animal and human beings. Animals are on race, they have instincts. Human beings can, there's another dimension. So I'm afraid what you are criticizing in one way, you are reinserting by the back door, that you say the model of sociobiology.
I'm not quite as convinced that sociobiology is perhaps as evil as you are, but I also think that, and I also think that partly it's that as a scientist, my natural inclination, if I may use that phrase, is to consider humans, or at least to see where we have our similarities with other animals. That's not to deny that there aren't places where humans differ from other animals. And again, to me, an interesting question is not, okay, can we pick the trait on which humans differ from other animals? And then you start arguing, is it language? Well, is what some primates have language? Is what that to me is not an interesting question. There are places where you can do that, but as a scientist, yeah, I'm interested in finding commonalities. I want to understand how selective pressures lead to different variations in behavior.
There's a school of thought that would say that gender or gender identity is completely socially constructed, and in opposition to that, there would be people in the field of evolutionary psychology, what used to be called, and still sometimes is called, sociobiology, that argue that there are some details of essential human nature. Could you say something about gender identity and about evolutionary psychology generally?
Sure. Like most people who have studied animal behavior and studied biology in general, this idea that you can divide traits into being completely socially constructed versus completely, and it's never been clear to me what's not socially constructed, so what does all that include? Does it include, what does it mean to say that something is biologically determined or genetically determined? That this is really not a dichotomy that's very productive, in part because all traits are a combination of genes in the environment, and I'm really not saying that flippantly, I'm saying that very sort of seriously and deeply, because otherwise you find yourself in this strange position of having to say, well, if gender identity or any other trait, so let's take another example that a lot of us tend to think of as being very socially constructed or something that is, the old term, learned or acquired or, whatever used to appear on that side of the dichotomy. Let's take speaking a foreign language. Most people would say, okay, speaking French is clearly something that's learned. But wait a minute. Okay, from first principles, it can't be completely learned because you can't teach anything to speak French. You can't teach, for example, your dog to speak French. Maybe some of you can, but by and large, we're not teaching our dogs to speak French. So there's clearly some biological rooting to that. And more profoundly, there are lots of inputs in the brain and everywhere else that go into doing this that mean that speaking French is a combination of what we're learning and what we're like biologically. You can't take them apart. What you can do is you can say, gee, is there a difference between traits, not the trait itself, but is there a difference between traits that's genetic or learned? You can try and come up with a way to solve that experimentally. So you could take two identical twins, they have the same genes, you could put them in different environments, and if they have the same trait, then you could say that the difference or lack thereof between them is genetic. If they have different traits, as they would if you put one in France and one in Italy, then you could say that the difference, between speaking French and speaking Italian is entirely learned. So that's what you can do. And I think the same thing applies to all of these other things, that no, we're not a completely blank slate. But that's really not a very productive direction to go with this, either with gender identity or I think any of these other considerations.
I had a question. Basically, the question is sort of why patriarchy? I guess I can see, how it's something that reinforces itself, but why in this time when there was a tipping point did it go one way and not the other? You suspect that question, but I'm curious your thoughts.
I mean, of course, the short and absolutely true answer is I have no idea. Yeah, this is an interesting thought, and I think part of it depends on whether you think, patriarchy as we know it or, consider it, arose in all of its manifestations all over the world from one similar source? Or I guess the bigger question to me is how many times did it arise independently? And there's some discussion about this, and I think you have to, so I'm going to cop out, basically, and I'm going to say that until you know that, it's going to be very difficult to figure it out, because then you're not going to be able to know whether you've got one event that's arisen multiple times, or one event that arose once, or an event that arose once and then spread, which would make it a much more remarkable sort of thing.
Do you know offhand who's looking into that?
I am not an anthropologist, and so, you know, historically, I do know that this idea that we had sort of the primordial matriarchy where, you know, like life was good and no one cared if women had big thighs, was, well, you know, you've seen all those little figurines, you know, the kind of plump ones, and people say that this came from some primordial, you know, matriarchy when everybody worshipped female goddesses who were in touch with the earth and so on and so forth. That's been pretty much debunked. Human societies definitely vary more in their sex roles than a lot of people have given credit for. Something that's become clear as more women have gone into studies of early human evolution. But no, I can't speak it with any more authority than that.
Not going to be very scientific here, but what's the question and answer regarding the oral sex topic?
Oh, I was sure you were. I was sure you were going to ask about the gay penguins, because that's been much more prevalent in the news. So the oral sex thing is that people want somehow, and you can tell what they want you to say. So what they're asking is, well, did humans kind of invent oral sex? And then you end up having to get kind of, or do other animals do that too? Then you end up having to get kind of graphic about, like, well, what exactly do you mean by oral sex? Listen, when I got a PhD, I did not think I was going to be on the phone with people answering questions like this. I work on crickets, but so my answer is actually often to do what I now have realized is kind of more helpful in these situations, is that rather than sort of answering it literally, I try and point out something that a lot of people don't realize, which is that in animals, like in people, sexuality is a lot more broadly construed than it is just in sort of like business-like sperm meets egg copulation and get it over with as fast as you can and only do it if you're going to make a baby type of thing. And so just like we've kind of gotten over that, I think, in human society, for a lot of animals, sex involves more than sort of the business side of things. And sex, for instance, in the bonobos, yes, they have oral sex. And no, I'm not going to talk in detail about what it is. So yes, they have oral sex, but for them it involves part of the way they operate in society. They use sex as a way to sort of resolve social tension. And so I had a student actually who did not understand this when I was explaining it in lecture, and so he came to talk to me afterwards. And I said, it's a way to resolve the kind of conflict in the social group, and he still looked puzzled. And I said, okay, so there's two bonobos and there's a banana, and if they were two chimpanzees and it was a banana, they would fight about it. But if there's two bonobos and there's a banana, they would have some sort of sexual encounter, potentially including oral sex, but they would have some kind of sexual encounter about it. And he still looked puzzled, and he said, well, but yeah, what about the banana? And I said, no, you don't get it. By then you wouldn't care about the banana. Anyway, I was trying to, the point being that I actually try to make these things into something a little bit more perhaps informative than the questioners are asking. But it is weird, like, why do I get so many questions about this? I don't know.
For all of us that saw March of the Penguins, can you tell us about the gay penguins?
The gay penguins is actually not from March of the Penguins. March of the Penguins was sort of the conservatives' counterpoint to the gay penguins. So, long before March of the Penguins, there was Roy and Silo, who are two male penguins in the Central Park Zoo in Manhattan. And Roy and Silo were devoted to each other. They did not want to spend any time with female penguins, though there were female penguins in the group. And so they were together, and they refused all attention from females, and they built a nest out of rocks together, and after a while they tried to incubate a rock together, and that didn't really go very far. one of the keepers at the Central Park Zoo gave them an egg that had been left by another penguin couple, because they can usually only rear one egg, and this couple had laid two. So he gave them one, and they incubated it and reared it successfully, and it hatched into a female penguin chick named Tango. And so they reared her, and that was all very nice. And somebody wrote a children's book about this called "And Tango Makes Three." And so I was, which is now, you know, being held up as sort of this example of how, being gay is completely natural, and gay families are natural, and so on and so forth. And so I got hauled into this, you know, to comment on homosexuality in animals and so on. And then the March of the Penguins came, and so, of course, they are holding up sort of monogamy and devoted parenting as the ideal. And so the Christian right has come into this and said that, this shows that, you know, being a good father is actually really natural. And I find that then there was also some weird stuff about intelligent design that got in there that I never quite understood. But, I mean, not in the movie, in sort of the arguments that ensued. But insofar as you know, what does this show us? Is it that gays are natural? Is it that, you know, being a devoted father is natural and monogamy is natural? The answer is yes, of course. And people are just really missing the point here, that we're not supposed to be looking at animals. You know, yes, that's right. So Roy and Silo did this, and we don't know how often it occurs in normal penguin populations in the wild, because, you know, they both sexes, you know, that whole black and white thing, they all look alike. And so you can't necessarily tell whether there might be more gay penguins out there, or, I mean, I don't, obviously they're not all gay because they're making more penguins. But in any event, you know, this idea that somehow you're going to base whether you think homosexuality is appropriate or acceptable or not by looking at Roy and Silo seems to me to have something really wrong with it, much though I adore Roy and Silo, who the latest so I have to give you the latest update, which is that they broke up. Or whatever you call it in birds. And so, let's see, what is it? Silo took up with a female penguin, which has given, you know, again, the people on, you know, the sort of conservative side, you know, all this ammunition. And the female penguin's named Scrappy, so they're together. And Roy is unfortunately, at least at last, I heard, alone. But, you know, he could find someone. Anyway, and so this all kind of goes on, but it's fascinating to me the kind of attention it gets and the way people really look at, you know, what's happening with this as a way to validate their own ideas. And I guess the final point is that they look at it not as a way to get information, but as a way to validate their own ideas.
So when I think of natural selection, I usually think of survival rather than the sexual aspect of it. And I guess, actually, the question I have is something related to that point. Are there any traits that are sort of specifically in humans as a result of sexual selection? Like, what do you feel sexual selection has contributed to the human genome, I guess?
It's contributed all of our secondary sexual characteristics, which are traits that are different between males and females. And I see even in this light, you got facial hair. I don't. Does it help you survive? I don't think so. Great example of a way that sexual selection has influenced the human genome. You know, we've got facial hair on human males, just like we've got, you know, horns on bighorn sheep. Well, I mean, except that you don't bash each other in the head with them. But, you know, other than that, there's lots and lots of examples of ways in which competition for reproduction as opposed to competition for survival have influenced virtually all species in which there are two sexes.
So this week's Newsweek actually featured a series of articles about women in leadership. And they developed some of this by talking about some of the differences in the way women lead. And one of my questions is, because we're starting to focus on these dichotomies between men and women, so we're talking specifically about human beings here, and you being considered a leader in the field of evolutionary biology, and also being a woman, can you speak to or talk a little bit about if we should be, as a community in science, be really focusing on these dichotomies and exploring how these dichotomies between the sexes can contribute to furthering science, or should we maybe be stepping back from
and trying to apply an asexual view as to just looking at individual people and how people can contribute. So maybe stepping back and different thing. Well, there's differences between women and women, so we're going to appreciate that women be this way and women this way. Actually, just step back and say, hey, as a person, like this person moves this way, so.
It's a good question. I'm very leery. First of all, I think that we don't focus, or one of the things that looking at biology has taught me is not to focus on the dichotomies, but to focus on the variability within them. And so one of the things that you learn, I think, when you look at animals is that there are these overlapping distributions. And people, but it's people, not the organisms themselves, will focus on the tail ends of the distributions. And that's and I think we do that because of our own biases. The animals are extremely variable. And so we do ourselves a disservice by focusing on the dichotomies, whether they're dichotomies where we say men are aggressive and that's great, women are, submissive and that's horrible, or whether we say, we're going to celebrate our differences and do this whole, like women are nurturing, and well, then what about men who want to be nurturing? What about women who don't necessarily fit this role that we're doing? One of the things I feel like we learn looking at animals and looking at biology is that there's a lot more overlap than there are these dichotomies. And I somewhere in the book, people are really focused on this idea about men and women being differently able to do math, for instance. And a lot of this, when you start looking at it, it's not at all clear that there are differences that are not completely explained by, say, cultural differences or differences in education and so forth. And yet people get really hung up on this, and they start looking at, well, there's voles where males can find their way in a maze better than females can and so forth. But really, men are a lot more like women than they are like voles, even male voles, which is, again, sort of like this, talking about how birds can't get married, is that one of these things where you feel like you really shouldn't have to say in public a lot, and yet I find myself having to say it a lot, that men are a lot like women. Really, they are a lot like women. So I guess to that extent I'm agreeing with you that we don't want to emphasize the differences, but I think when you look at biology, you start realizing how the differences break down, not how they get emphasized. We can take like one, yeah, sure, we'll take one more.
I'll try to brief. It's obvious to me, listening to some of the questions tonight, that the whole concept of evolutionary psychology or sociobiology or whatever is a very touchy issue for a lot of people still. And I would just like to ask your personal opinion about at what point do you think we're going to have a real mature science to the point where we can use well-grounded scientific examples from the animal world, all the way from crickets up through humans, to finally begin to make definitive conclusions about to what extent human cultural production is biologically grounded and to what extent we're just different than the rest of the animals. And I was just wondering, it seems to me like this is a question we're just beginning to scratch the surface of, and I was wondering if as an expert on this kind of thing, I think we're anywhere near a mature science that can begin to answer some of these concerns that we have about this.
I don't know when we're going to, I don't want to sort of say, in 2082 or something, so I'm not going to give you an answer like that, but one of the things that would go a long way to assuaging my concerns about evolutionary psychology is to have an acknowledgement about the degree to which our biases about our own sex roles are influencing the way we construct our hypotheses. And that's been a problem for me in reading a lot of this, that I look at this and I think, well, but wait a minute, you're doing this with an unspoken assumption that this and such is true, or that, we're always going to find this, and so forth. And it seems to me that it's very, very difficult to step out of those biases when you're studying your own species. I study crickets for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that it's real hard to anthropomorphize them all that much. And hey, you laugh, it's actually easy to anthropomorphize them at least a little bit. And I think that there's been a remarkable sort of flippancy on the part of a lot of people studying evolution and human behavior, and a lack of caution in talking about how, oh, well, yes, you know, if we can find that there's a waist to hip ratio that, you know, males prefer in a college class in psychology in, you know, state X, that therefore means that it's adaptive for all men to, you know, and it's just, wait a minute, we haven't gotten there yet. And I think that, so I guess I'm sorry, I don't know when we're going to get there, but I don't think we're going to get there until we start being a little bit more mindful about the pitfalls that our biases can lead us into, and I'm not seeing as much of that as I would like.
Please join me in thanking.